Hello, everyone. I am Melinda Brianna Epler, founder and CEO of Change Catalyst and author of How to Be an Ally. I'm your host of Leading with Empathy and Allyship. Welcome. Allyship is about learning, showing empathy, and taking action. That process often includes learning, unlearning, and relearning, then building empathy for people with different experiences, and above all, taking consistent action. So each week we'll learn from somebody new. Please be open to new ways of thinking and understanding. You can learn more about my work and sign up to join us for a live recording at ally.cc. Let's get started. Hello, everyone. Today, our guest is Dax-Devlon Ross. He is the founder and principal of Dax-Dev and Third Settlements. He's a Puffin Writing Fellow at Type Media Center and is the author of 6 books. We'll be talking about the changing climate around DEI in the last couple of years and now looking into 2023. We'll also talk about the growing trend of BIPOC savior syndrome and what it looks like to navigate the DEI space as a Black cis man. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you, Dax. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think we're going to get a chance to touch on some topics that I don't often get to talk about. So I'm going to be in a bit of in a risk-taking space with you today. And
I love it.
You take care, hold me as well as I try to step out and share a bit of what's really deep in my heart and as I think about the work, but appreciating just being here with you right now.
Will do, and honored to have that trust. And for our YouTube audience, before we get started, let's just describe ourselves for anybody who is blind or low vision who's tuning in on YouTube. So I'm a white woman. I have my hair is pulled back today. It's mostly blonde in the front with some red, and I'm wearing a long sleeve blue shirt. And then in my background is the same as it always is. For those of you who have heard that before, on one side is a narrow bookshelf with a plant going down it. And on the other side is some plants surrounding my own book, How to Be an Ally.
And I am a Black man in his 40s, my hair is close on the sides, high on the top. You know, this is a hairstyle that was popular when I was a teenager, and somehow it came back again in my 40s, and I get to participate in it a second time, and it makes me really joyful. I'm wearing a black shirt, and I'm wearing a smile because I'm really happy to be here, and I like the smile I see coming back at me. As a matter of fact, behind me is a painting. The first piece of art I've ever bought in my life was from a dear friend of mine, artist by the name of Ellington Robinson. It is a painting of Miles Davis in a red room with all of the album covers, all of his album covers on the wall behind him. And I always just love the detail of the paintings, the floor, the wood floor, and the richness of the red wall against which all the pictures, all the album covers are situated. And then it has this opening in the middle of the painting, this open door, and it just kind of, and each open door leads to another open door and another open door, kind of symbolizing the deep corridors of Miles's mind. And Miles is sitting by himself on a stool, holding his chin, with his trumpet, pondering.
I love that. Our ASL interpreters today are Amber and Christina from our incredible partners, Interpreter Now, and you can learn more about them at interpreter-now.com. So to start, Dax, would you share a bit with us about your story, where you grew up, how you ended up getting here doing the work that you do now?
I love that. Thank you for that question. So I identify strongly as a Gen X post-civil rights baby born in Washington, D.C., the end of the Vietnam War, in the middle of a transitioning and changing America that was experimenting with this idea of integration in the years immediately following Dr. King's assassination. And growing up in a city that was, I always say DC is a southern town masquerading as a northern city. But it was a chocolate city. So to grow up in a city where it was predominantly Black folks in positions of power and authority, and then my entire life was surrounded by Black folks who were, thriving in a variety of ways. It was, and later in life, in my early teenage years, having some real close proximate exposure to a different Black America experience. I would go to the South and see my family in Richmond, but I think what it really was a turning point for me in my own, and I think it's connected to the work I do now, was through basketball. I started to travel around first the city, then around the country, and I got to both see and be in community with a different American experience, an experience that was more viscerally, directly linked to oppression. And that was experienced through a lot of my friends and on my basketball teams I played with. And a lot of that, it was a complicated space to be as a middle-class kid in that context, because, I was growing up I grew up in an America where despite living in a very thriving Black community, I couldn't always turn on the television or find sort of diverse models of Black male identity in the world. So sports, there's always the joke in Black communities, not just Black communities, but in communities that are seeking opportunity, I should say, but it's like you can play ball, you can rap, you can do these things that are very, very specific. I had a bit of an expanded universe, perhaps, and so insofar as I had people in my life who I could look to, lawyers, doctors, whatever else have you, but I still felt that there were these archetypes that were presented to me around what Black identity is supposed to look like and supposed to be in American context. And as I was pointing out, just sort of encountering and being close to friends who had a very different lived socioeconomic experience, it created a lot of questions for me about my own identity. Sometimes provoked by like just us, being charged with not being really fully Black because I wasn't like living in poverty. And quite frankly, like there was times where I would question the authenticity of my experience because it didn't reflect a lot of what was being processed and presented to me about Black authenticity. Growing up in the 80s and 90s, Black authenticity was often being presented to me through the lens of my music and the culture. And I was celebrating a different lifestyle, the hood, the ghetto, whatever you call it. And to not be from that place created questions for me around identity. So whether it was basketball or popular culture, I found myself on a journey to really identify and claim my Black identity. That led me through, I think, a politicization in my college years, a political awakening around how that had come to be. I grew up in a city like DC the downtown was decimated, and I didn't understand why downtown was decimated. But then I started to understand the riots that had happened in the 60s. And I understood then deeper from that, like what was going on in Black communities around and the social unrest and what was driving that. And then you start to get more awareness around things like COINTELPRO and the various means by which American society has sought to marginalize and continue the oppression of Black folks. That awakens me politically. Then I go to law school, and in law school, I think I kind of get some development and awareness of the ways in which power operates, in the ways in which power sustains itself, in the way in which law is used as a weapon or as a shield. And that, I think, was powerful for me. But realizing I didn't want to be a lawyer. I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be someone who was engaged in intellectual work. And through my journey, from law school going to New York City to become a writer, I also became a teacher and an educator and a youth worker. And as a youth worker and as an educator, especially I was working in East New York and Harlem and the Bronx and the Lower East Side. I'm interacting and working with young people from all these different backgrounds. And it was both edifying for me, but enlightening to me because I could connect with them. And I discovered that in that work, I could communicate and I could translate across difference. Some of that having to do, I think, with my experiences growing up, playing ball, being in different worlds, and that was able to bring that to bear. And I think I developed really strong interpersonal skills, which I didn't know were the roots and foundation of DEI work. I didn't think of it as, oh, this is the work that you need to be able to go and work with people from diverse backgrounds. It was just me as an educator working with young people. And so I never went to get a DEI degree, or I never went to get these things. I had some pedagogical background, intellectual curiosity, and some lived experience that I think conspired to put me in a position to do the kind of work that I do now with some level of capacity at multiple levels. I can do analytical work, I can do strategic work, but I can also do deep interpersonal work. And that, I think, has allowed me to have a really unique work experience that I'm really proud of. But that's my journey, my story. And if I were to tell you more, I'd tell you about my father and my mother and these amazing folks that created the foundation, and my grand folks from the South, and all the deep friendships that I have across difference and across generation that have all, whether those who I've met and known or the people who I read and find solidarity and kinship with, all of those have been the stew in which I've been sort of stirred.
The stew. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Can you also share a little bit about the work that you do?
Yeah,
so folks know what that looks like.
Totally. So, I identify as a multi-hyphenate, and a multi-hyphenate meaning like I do operate in the world and think of myself as a writer, at times a journalist, and I do work as a practitioner. And I think that these two feed one another. And the practice work, it presents and shows up in the world as doing work with organizations and people to help them. The word I'm using for it right now is the one that I learned from Ossie Davis. So I was listening to an interview from him recently, but helping people get clear on their moral assignment. And what I mean by that is, I think that we are socialized and raised and educated in this society to become really good at our jobs and good at those sort of things that are rewarded. And then at some other point, whether it's when we're in school or later in life, in a relationship or in an organization, we've discovered that we need other things to be successful. We need to turn on other aspects of ourself. And so the work I do tends to be around helping people, and it comes under the rubric and the guise of DEI or equity work. But it is, helping people connect with their story, helping people connect with their deep aspirations, their humanity, and helping people really connect with the ways in which they've been disconnected from and one another, other human beings. So that's sometimes coaching leaders, to help them really understand how they need to lead and can lead with empathy and with a broader sort of set of tools in a new and changing workplace where leaders who've been historically rewarded for just being productive are now being asked to be more than that for their people, to guide with a different and broader lens. It can sometimes present as doing workshops and trainings and retreats for staff. Sometimes it's oriented around the concept of leadership, which I think is a sort of broad bucket of things, which are ultimately about how do you show up? How do you guide people? How do you do it with vulnerability, humility, but also do it with courage? Sometimes it's doing strategy work where I'm working on a strategic plan with an organization, but still trying to use equity as a compass, really, so that we don't just make decisions that are based on X, Y, and Z, but are taking a broader set of voices into considerations through our strategic planning process. Sometimes it's designing new pilot programs and projects. Like for one of the things I'm really excited about recently is working with organizations that don't have historical relationship, but have decided they want to come together to do some work together. So we're really trying to help them identify what does it mean to be a partner with someone, and not just think about it at a superficial level of a transaction, but what do we have to change about ourselves? What kind of things do we need to talk about? What kind of decisions do we need to make? And do all of that in a spirit of sort of not doing more harm, and also addressing and undoing some of the harm that's been done in the ways we've organized structures and institutions historically, whether it's about how power tends to be situated in very small pockets and other people get excluded. How do we design something that disrupts that? Or it's about like, how do we, become more of an environment that is one in which, we don't just bring people in because we want to get diversity, but we know how to actually activate that perspective that those folks are bringing. And we're willing to allow that to help change who we are and even the work that we do. So it's not just come fit into my environment and like be the Black person here now, but it's like bring all your full self and experience, and let's evolve this organizational entity with you in mind as you as part of and a steward of this work as well. Yeah. That's the work. That's the work.
That's the work. That is the work every day. All those conversations, all those actions, and it's one action at a time too, right? So both of us have been working in diversity, equity, and inclusion for a while, and I talk to a lot of people. I talk to a lot of people in my job, and as you do too, I'm sure. And there are a lot of assumptions that diversity, equity, and inclusion fundamentally shifted in 2020. After George Floyd was murdered, there was a collective awakening I in a way that I had not seen before. And there's an assumption that that kind of awakening fundamentally shifted everything, companies, and so on. And I do think, I do think in some companies, there is more and deeper change happening, and there's new companies that are coming to diversity, equity, and inclusion for the first time. There's a new level of companies feeling a sense of accountability, I think, and more individuals working to create change overall. And it's not quite the wave that I think a lot of people assumed, hoped would happen, and change, of course, doesn't happen overnight either. So where this is leading is, where do you see the changes that have happened in the last couple of years, from 2020, 2021, and then 2022, where we are now? Yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, so I try to track the news and try to track the ways in which, I try to use history as a guide. And a book that I go back to quite often is Dr. King's final book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. He wrote this book was published the year before he was assassinated. And it is reflective of what I call the period. There's a great film about this, a period in his life called King in the Wilderness. There's a film called King in the Wilderness, which is, I watch it probably every year around his, the celebration of his life, because it captures like the last year of his life. The whole purpose of the film is to tell you what was it like for King after 1963. What was his life like after that high water moment of the high water moments of 1964, 65, the voting rights legislation and of course the accommodations legislation that were transformative in many ways, but at the same time, it raised questions for him and for others around, well, what is your utility now that we've done this? Now we've passed these laws. We good right now, King? And he, of course, had a broader vision for where the work needed to go, and to globalize that work and to make that work not just be about civil rights here and in these public accommodations and in voting, but it needs to start extending to an internationalist view. And he started to talk about Vietnam. We all know this. And that's when he started to see the turn against him. And that's when he started to see, the pushback. And in that last book, he writes about what he calls the white backlash. And he talks about it as a normal and sort of consistent feature of change in America. We saw it in Reconstruction. We see it every time that there is a moment wherever there's this perception that people of color, and specifically Black folks, are getting too much or getting too far, there's a pullback. And so I already knew that was coming. And so, and it's not a pessimistic view. I have to prepare myself for that. So the preparation means in 2020, like burst through that door and do the work, right? But also understand that in 2021, that energy was going to shift, which it did. I started to see, and that shift was to some extent instigated starting at the White House with, our then president, Donald Trump, 45, the way in which he started to target critical race theory. And that became, and then he was able to use the executive order powers to start to shut down conversation at the federal level. And even though Biden came in and lifted that up, it still gave people a signal. So you started to see Florida, with its bills, and you started to see all these, and you started to see teachers being monitored, and you started to see Virginia with this hotline or this anonymous website you could, or email address or email that you could send to snitch on teachers who were maybe possibly teaching things that were not part of history. So this sort of pushback started to really catch momentum throughout 2021. And I think what we started to see in the work was that some people, it was understood that was going to happen, but some people, it really shook them. And then you connect that with the push, the challenge throughout 2021 to bring people back to the office, and the work from home sort of tug of war that was happening around CEOs, like, come back in, people like, nah, I don't want to come back in. So there were a lot of tensions that were, I think, inflaming and keeping the work both present, but also creating a sort of set of questions. And there was another feature I think that is really relevant to what was happening in 2021 in particular was these mass conversations within organizations that had been initiated also kicked up a lot of, stirred up a lot of organizational chaos. And you saw in a lot of organizations, power dynamics being shifted and challenged, racial identities being challenged, power being contested. The sort of terms like white supremacy culture became sort of like ubiquitous. And so anytime anybody did something that might have had some or might have been perceived to be sort of white supremacist, it was getting called, like there was a lot of tension. And I think there was harm caused in some of those spaces. And I think that what we fail to recognize and what I try to own is that even as a person doing DEI work, I have to continue to be doing my work, my own healing, my own restoration, my own learning. And I think what I experienced was in some places, DEI work it became like a blunt object and it wasn't being deployed as in such a nuanced way. And that gave ammunition, it gave power to those people who were seeing the social messaging and the pushback, and they were already feeling the sort of tensions, and it allowed, I think, for some of the real momentum to erode. That said, I don't, I think that there were quite a few people and quite a few organizations that have continued to persist. I would offer that 2022 has been a hard year for me emotionally. I have seen to watch the pullback, like people don't respond all of a sudden, things get canceled all of a sudden, and no one wants to give you an explanation for why, or all of a sudden the resources that were there a year ago are no longer there. It's not about loss of money, it's about loss of will. And it pains me to the point that you made earlier, like this was, for me as a generation, this was the first time I saw what was happening. The first time I saw this sort of mass opening that, of course, I think Me Too was also kind of cascading into that. And to see that shut down, to see that pull back, to see that sort of being sort of erased by some people or some folks is hard. But I am also clear that we are not going back to where we were before. Even if there's a rollback, it's not a rollback to what it was prior to. And I think there are some folks who are still struggling with that there's a new reality. And that new reality is we see the resurgence of unions, not to say unions are the answer all the time, but it is the resurgence of the mobilization of people who recognize that they have a shared interest. And I think that's connected to the kinds of conversations that were being initiated in the George Floyd era. I think we see people like really starting to flex and sort of imagine their own sort of work-life balance and creating healthier boundaries and making sure that those boundaries are held. That wasn't something that we saw before. We see organizations being more aware of health and wellness and being able to put resources toward that because there's a recognition that actually has a bottom line implication for us as an organization. So I see a lot happening, and I see the continuous areas for growth and as we go into 2023. But what are you seeing? I mean, you asking me all the questions. I'm curious about your perspective. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I do. I see a lot of that. I've definitely seen that. We have seen at Change Catalyst overall that there's a shift. There are more people that are aware of the issues.
Yeah.
Without question, and also I believe that just like with American politics, that there is some legitimization of those folks that are pushing back in a way that there hasn't been in my life. Well, I mean, I was born in the 70s, so that was a time, and we, words became unacceptable that are now people are suddenly able to say them again, and sentiments are able to be expressed, and when people start to express those sentiments, then they start to believe them, and more people believe them, and so I think that there is this unfortunate centering, and as a result, when you, like you said, I think that's really an important thing, that when companies are bringing folks back to the workplace after this kind of some polarization has happened, that you put people back in the workplace with that, and and you get some explosions, many explosions happening in the workplace. And diversity, equity, and inclusion has, for some companies, become more, how do we get back to inclusive conversations? How do we, how do we just have a conversation about this? And how do we start to build empathy for each other? How do we rebuild some connections that maybe were lost? Maybe we thought they were there and they weren't actually there, but now it's clear they're not there.
I think that's the thing, which is, I think, I don't want to say, I struggle when people say, how do we get back to, but I'm like, I don't think we ever were there. I think what we had was, it was a sense of like we could say things that were probably maybe reckless or irresponsible, and then folks would maybe have a side chatter, but they wouldn't come back and confront you about it. And so what people are uncomfortable with now is that you can't just say the thing and somebody at least doesn't say, so here's my experience of what you're saying. Now, what I think we can all continue to work on and develop is, if my goal is to help someone grow and learn and move forward with it, how do I give them the feedback in a timely enough fashion and in a tone and texture that both conveys my truth and that they can still hear and take action on? And I think that sometimes gets tough because things can be triggering. And when I'm triggered and emotional, things might come out different than if I've really gathered. And that's why I think when I look at the DEI work that I want to see people do, it's engaging them in practice. Like, don't just dump information on people. Folks need situational work, because as we say with anything else, you don't expect anybody to show up and know how to deal with anything without having practice doing it. And somehow we think that's different with DEI work. Like, well, I took a training on this, so I therefore know. No, you don't know how to show up in that conversation when it happens. You choose silence sometimes. You go off the camera, you leave, because you've allowed sort of the fear of what the worst thing that can happen is to overcome the beautiful possibility if I step into this with some courage and grace. Now, the conditions have to be created for that. There needs to be some safety in there, and there needs to be a recognition of some grace in there. But as people, I have encountered that as long as people believe that your intentions are true and real, and yet you're in a learning posture, there's a lot of willingness to work with folks and learn with folks. But my concern is for those who are pushing back and who are anxious about DEI work and just want to get back to the inclusive thing, is that what that means is you want to go back to a place that's comfortable for you, and you're okay with everybody else being uncomfortable. And B, it's like, it just feels very, it just feels like not a reality, given the fact that we spend so much of our lives and times in workplaces now. We're asked because of our society, we work. And whether it's in an office or out of an office, it's with people. And so therefore, we can't expect to have these clear lines between personal and professional that we once had maybe thought we could enjoy.
Yeah.
There's a lot of more interplay there. Like, I bring myself to work. Now, we can talk about, do I need to bring my whole self in all contexts? We can have that conversation. Right. But either way, some aspect of who I am is here in the room. And so when I hear something or see something, you can't just ask me to just act as if it didn't happen, So I'm of the belief that, to go to your point earlier on inclusive conversations is a good place to be and to sit. But I'm more interested personally in conversations that allow us to be, that allow us to sort of speak our truths, hear those truths, and challenge us to be courageous. Like, I mean, inclusive is cool, but courageous is what we need.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
So I see what you're saying, though.
You can have both
too,
that. Right? You can have courageously inclusive conversations where you're really, you're being courageous, you're putting yourself out there, you're taking risks, and also you're thinking about how that language that you're using is going to impact somebody else and the whole of what is happening here. Yeah.
Right. And that takes time. That takes practice, and that takes messing up sometimes. That makes getting it wrong. But what I don't want inclusive to be is a euphemism for safe.
Absolutely.
And a safe. And I think sometimes when I'm encountering it is that we need to make it safe for white people, right? We need to make it safe for white men, or we need to make it safe for, and it's like, folks, we can, that is how it's always been.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the goal is to get back to that, then I think what we're suggesting here is that that's who we're centering. And that's the only people in the experience that we're centering. And that's a problem, I think. And I think we know that that's a problem. And that's not to problematize any individual, any group. It's to just suggest that we have to broaden the center. We have to make the center wider. We have to expand the center, and not use the term inclusion as a euphemism in a way to actually signal like that we're doing something that's for all, but really it's for the comfort of only a certain group of people.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important. There's a distinction between safety and comfort. Those are not the same thing. Yeah.
I want to hear how do you explain that to people? Because I think that's a really powerful distinction that I'm at times trying to make sure that I'm not being insensitive when I try to draw that distinction for people. So how do you distinguish between safety and comfort?
Well, the first thing I just came to mind that I think is important to say is that sometimes you have to get quite uncomfortable in order for everyone to feel safe. And, and that safety is, you create a safe space, especially around diversity, equity, and inclusion, so that we can get uncomfortable, so that we can learn, so that we can grow. So we're creating this space where it is okay to make mistakes. It is okay to, as long as you're correcting those, you're apologizing, you're recognizing, apologizing, and correcting those mistakes.
Yeah.
It's a safe space to make mistakes, and it's also a space where all of us can learn and grow about ourselves, about each other as well.
Yeah.
When we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I want to get to some other things that I know that are on our minds.
Sure.
And the first is the term BIPOC savior syndrome. Can you talk about that? What that means? And
first of all, I don't even know if it's an official term. I mean, we throw savior syndrome onto a lot of things.
Yeah.
But I think that it's appropriate to attach it to the BIPOC experience that I've encountered over the last couple of years, especially as it relates to senior leadership. Because when I think back to one of the outcries in 2020 was situated along the lines of representation in senior leadership, whether it was in corporate America or the nonprofit space or in public sector. That was like a flashpoint, was looking at whether it was, Fortune 500 leaders, foundation CEOs, looking at that and seeing, here is something that's presenting to us in 2020 that is highly problematic in terms, if we really are a pluralistic, diverse culture, how do we explain these disparities? And I think we were clear at that point in time that there are some systemic injustices that have resulted in a picture of us in leadership that does not represent us and does not reflect all of us. So one solution to that was to find people of color and women. And if you can find a person of color who is a woman or who identifies as a woman, even better.
Right.
And qualified, of course, absolutely. And situate folks in leadership roles. Now, these are people who, quite frankly, have probably already been qualified for a very long time. It was never a question of qualifications. It would be some kind of response, some kind of explanation, such as, experience, or, some reason might have been conjured to explain why they were not elevated and given the opportunity to lead in the ways in which their resumes and even all their sort of glowing reviews and everything else should seem to indicate and dictate. But from what I've gathered, and I do not have the data in front of me, we saw the transformation. And I looked at my LinkedIn feed. My LinkedIn feed was I saw it happen there. I saw it happen there in 2021. And what I started to also see, both in the work I was directly doing with organizations and leaders, was a lot of these folks were walking into fires. They were walking into places that were a hot mess. They were walking into situations that were cauldrons for conflict. So they were then being asked to do two jobs: be the BIPOC face that is now demonstrating and symbolically how we are different as an organization, and be effective in your role. And oh, by the way, this is going on. You got to fill this position and da 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 da. Like all of, so it was like be super black or be super brown or be the super woman. Like, and what I think started to begin to emerge was also a thing that I think a lot of times the folks who are in selection roles, whether it's the board of trustees or the board of governors or those who are in senior roles, don't understand is that there are different levels of identity and affinity and conflict and trauma that leaders of color have to navigate in relation to people who they share identity with. So there's sometimes I used to tell when I was a teacher, I used to get really frustrated because people would think just because I was a young black man that every young black man, young black teenager, or a middle school student was going to identify me. I was like, nah, that's not true, because some of them have really traumatic relationships with the males in their lives, right? Some of them have really fraught histories. And so you assume that just because I'm the dude, I should coach the basketball team, I should run the chess club, I should do everything. I should be the black male savior. And what ends up happening is I burn out, right? Because A, that's just not reality or sustainable. And also it denies the complexity of the history that we have all identified, that we've all adopted. And that played out, I think, for a lot of black leaders and like leaders of color as they entered organizations where all of a sudden they were getting pushback that the predecessor wasn't getting. All of a sudden, the funders that they were seeking were asking questions that their predecessor didn't have to answer. All of a sudden, they identified they didn't have some of the resources from which to draw, meaning whether it's like necessary board members and or supporters that their predecessor, but they're still being held to the same standard of accountability and the timeline. And all of that, I think, it's the quiet challenge and pain that I think a lot of folks felt, which was like, I got here, but now that I'm here, it's like, is this what I really wanted? Is this what I really, and can I stay here? So that was the syndrome is, I think, it's something that I think we as a society, it's like the old joke about Obama. Obama got to be president when the economy was in the tank, right? Mm-hmm. It's that same idea that, we get a new black Supreme Court justice, Supreme Court justice, the first black woman, she's the Supreme Court justice, and Ketanji Brown. But she gets to enter into an environment that is incredibly, the deck is stacked against her.
Yeah.
So you never get to go in. And I don't say never, I don't say, but it is that there is a prevailing sense that when people enter the opportunity that other folks have and have historically had, they get it when either nobody else wants it or when it's been diminished in value or in some way it's been compromised. And now you are being charged with both being as effective, if not more effective, and doing healing work at the same time. Mm-hmm. That's the syndrome. That's the issue.
Yeah.
And we're kind of addicted to it as a society, quite frankly. We're addicted to looking for, people of color and women, folks who are sort of non-dominant identities to, in moments of crisis, to, go in there and just, get it right, fix it. And then when everything smooths out again, as we see, that things start to kind of cycle back. We start to see people leaving and not being replaced with another person of color. We're going back to the status quo, which again isn't about those. I want to be clear. I'm not saying that anybody that folks who get the role are underqualified. I know everybody's qualified. I'm not talking about qualifications. It's just about let's deal with and reckon with that reality and that history and that sort of ongoing and enduring challenge that we seem to encounter and never fully figure out and work out and talk out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think in diversity, equity, and inclusion, historically, even more so, maybe even more so, is we have historically asked one person to change everything, and we know that doesn't work. It is all of us that have to do the work of change.
Right.
Can you share a bit about how you navigate this space as a Black man, and what are some things that you experience personally? How is that experience?
So I think I should also qualify by saying that I'm navigating this space as a Black man who also has a terminal degree, who has, some measure of connection, who has had some privileged educational background and experience. And I think also I know I've become adept at being able to sort of navigate spaces true to myself, but in ways that I think nevertheless allow others, to feel some level of comfort. That's not about like me soft toeing or soft pedaling, but it's just something about my disposition, which allows me to navigate a lot of different kind of spaces and to do so in a place that I think I'm able to build relationship, build community, do it authentically and be effective. That said, I'm not in any way under the illusion that the country's relationship with Black men is eternally fraught, at least up to now. Maybe not in the future, but eternally, my experience has been very fraught. We are at times in more, if you look at every statistical category, when we try to look at racial equity issues, whether it's around education, job access, criminal justice interaction, even life expectancy. I had this one session I would do where I would look at the life cycle and show how disparities show up across the entire life cycle of people in this country. But if you will get into the data, Black men, and I don't want to never exclude Black women from this conversation, but as a Black man, one of the things I identify is, we are trending in the wrong place in so many of these categories, whether it's education access, whether it's jobs, whether it's all sorts of those data points. So in one sense, we are the problem that needs to be solved in this society. And we're the problem that people are always trying to solve. And people are very comfortable with us in that role. How do we deal with mass incarceration, which is, of course, an issue around race? How do we deal with violence, which is an issue that implicates like community violence, which implicates Black men? And what I think that creates is somewhat of a disposition in our society where folks are very comfortable with Black men in the role of being served in these institutions. I encounter this a lot in the nonprofit space, where there's a comfort in like us as, again, a problem to be solved, a group to be supported, some ways to be helped. And there's a lot of demographic data and history that explain why that's the case. What I find connected to that in my own experience is that it, to some extent, and I've had people actually say this to me, is like, there's a surprise when they encounter me doing the DEI work. Insofar as, sure, of course, like it would make some level, but there's much more comfortable if I presented as and was a Black woman, and I think there's like, or if I was, an identity that was not a Black male not Black cis male who does the work. And I think I have a lot of folks who work with me, I have a lot of clients, I have a lot of folks who respect what I've done, but it's been hard earned. It's like there's a lot of doubt, I think, invariably. And I think it helps that I have a law degree and some things that are, but there is this question around how sensitive can you actually be? How attuned can you be to other people's marginalization and and it's like, there's a sense that I encounter, and maybe I'm inaccurate in this, that my perception and analysis is limited to Black people. I can't have a perspective about anything other than that very specific group and experience. I had a client reach out to me recently and say, hey, I had done some work with them around race a couple of years ago. And they're like, listen, hey, we're trying to find someone to do a workshop on gender. Do you know anyone? I'm like, interesting. That they would never presume that I could do anything having to do with gender. And I think there's something about the assumption that men, and particularly cis men, don't have anything to say or don't have any aptitude and awareness of how patriarchy operates and our role in patriarchy, or a sensitivity and awareness of how to navigate and negotiate the issues that are gender issues. And it's interesting in part because I often find that it's the case that specifically in the nonprofit space, men are the minority. And particularly Black men, we are the minoritized group. And yet there's a perception that we don't have so that experience that I'm having as a Black man in those contexts isn't a gendered experience. It's still a racialized experience, but it's not a gendered experience. So there's some ways in which I feel like there's been an erasure of, or at least an unwillingness and inability to see the complexity of us, the complexity of Black male identity. And that's not always on everybody else. That's also on us, how we've allowed ourselves to be presented, because I think we're also often closed off to vulnerability, closed off to allowing a sort of the full spectrum of ourselves to be seen. A lot of my friends who've been successful in the corporate space have had to let go of certain things, or at least have had to tamp down certain aspects of their personality and identity in order to be successful, right? So
Right.
they don't bring certain things into the workplace because they know that the lane in which they can be successful and operate does not allow for them to really bring the complexity of their identity into the space. They can be Black up to a point, right? And you got to know where that line is. And if you don't, then you won't make it. You won't make it to partner. You won't make it to senior. But so it's a fraught thing, and I think I can see those things, and I've been successful to some extent in my work because I'm able to negotiate those things. But I do find that is this unspoken and often, it's unseen dynamic that I experience, and and that others who I connect with and who identify similarly also experience. So it's not a negative thing in so much as it's one of those things that I navigate, and it's my experience.
Yeah, I think that. Well, I will say in navigating diversity, equity, and inclusion as a white woman, there are a lot of assumptions that people make about me as well. So I think there is a bigger, there isn't a really important, maybe it's work within the diversity, equity, and inclusion world that needs to happen too, where we're really questioning that more, and we're really opening more. Yeah. I'm not sure. What are the solutions?
I will suggest that I think that we have to be aware and mindful that as humans living in a society, a hyper-competitive society in which people are often commodified, that we can be vulnerable to some of the same risks in the DEI space that anybody else can be, which is to say essentializing folks, stereotyping folks or across just based on presentation. We are products of, and we are always exposed to the various harms and toxins that are affecting the society writ large. So it stands to reason that they could be affecting our relationships, even within our communities, our DEI communities. There are broader conversations happening around what's going on in progressive organizing spaces and progressive movement spaces, some of which I alluded to earlier on how organizations are dealing with sort of the combustion. A lot of that's connected to generational stuff, like if you were, identify as a Gen Xer or a Boomer, somehow you don't know what's going on. There's like perception, there's like generational tensions that I think are intersecting with this. And I think that the sort of encouragement, and I don't know if I would call it advice, but like the things that I would ask for consideration is, to what extent are people who are those of us who do this work that is called DEI, and the broad headline of it, sometimes it's called emancipation work, it's anti-racist work, it's like whatever you call it work. It's like, are we continuing to do our own work? Are we continuing to make sure that we're doing step backs and doing reflection points around how am I showing up if I'm consulting or if I'm leading DEI in an organizational space? Like, who am I here showing up for? Am I here in the consulting capacity, for instance, if I'm off, am I here for the people, or am I here only and exclusively for the people who are signing the check? It's like, who and how and to what extent am I pushing myself or continuing to challenge myself to remain open to where my own gaps in learning and understanding are. I've recognized more recently in particular, like, whether it's like becoming more acquainted with understanding the trans community work, work in the disability rights community. I think that there are growth areas for me in the work. I have some of the baselines, but I think I just need to do, whether it's also just, there's more work for me to do. And I think that we should be okay, even as experts, naming that we have our own work to do. And not think that just because somebody presents us as expert, that the only way to be an expert is by us, espousing expertise. Sometimes it's asking questions. Sometimes it's acknowledging that you don't have the answer, because that's part of what the work is as well. Is like, how do we help people know that presenting as certain all the time isn't actually helpful and healthy? And so I got to embody that too at times and say, I don't have the answer, or I know somebody else who I can bring in who maybe can help us do this, or I should do this work alongside other people. That is, I think, really a challenge for DEI workers. in an environment such as ours that can often put us against one another, that can essentialize our work, that can create scarcity mindset around whether it's going to be available next year or next month, and can draw us away from what I believe are the civil rights and human rights roots of our work. I call this work civil rights work, and a friend of mine said it a couple of years ago. It's civil rights work in an organizational context. And just like anybody who does that kind of work, you can lose your way. You can lose your way. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means that you're operating in an environment where any number of us, any one of us can lose sight of the goal, and we might just need to be stewarded back to our center and back to our core. And so the way to I don't want to call it prevent that, but the way to sort of be on the watch out for and look out for that is to have a community that holds you accountable, have people that hold you accountable. That's part of staying in your work. Not overworking yourself so that you're constantly and only and exclusively just working and not sort of pausing and processing and reflecting and taking time, taking on and putting yourself in challenging experiences and environments, not just sort of being a hardliner about who I work with and because there can be some things that are surprising you, and there will be nuance around those who you think you understand and know. And there could be some learning that happens there as well. Those are just some of the things I think I would offer, some insights and some considerations.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dax, I feel like we've scratched the surface of there's so much more here.
Of course.
I want to end by just asking. This is action oriented. We want people to take action after they listen to or watch the conversation and really take action. And folks who are listening and watching are looking for those action items.
Of course.
What action would you like people to take coming away from our conversation?
I think it's the action of, after these last couple of years, as you do some end of year reflection on an inventory on how you did I lose 5 pounds this year? Did I as you do your whatever your inventory looks like, also do some inventory around how you've shown up in these, whether it's these conversations or in this work. And as you set your goals for next year, for what you want to achieve next year, have something that's connected to this. If you're a manager, is it about your own learning or about how you're advocating and advancing others? If you're an individual contributor, is it about your learning? Is it about how you contribute? If you're a senior leader, is it about how you can ensure that you're continuing to make sure that the conversations aren't not just conversations, but that you're moving towards operationalizing and implementing? So it's those two things. It's if you're an end of year reflection person, do some inventory about how you've shown up in this last year and where you feel like, you have how you presented. And if it's about goal setting, as many of us do in January and the top of the year, it's putting a goal around this work, whether it's your learning, what you're going to read, who you're going to expose, who you're going to do, how you're going to lead your team, whatever it is, put something to it, check back on it and be accountable to it. And also tell somebody else. Don't just keep it to yourself. I tell people because someone told me years ago, and I do deeply believe that we got to be accountable. We can't just say, I'm reading books. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You can't just tell me you saw, you listened to such and such, you listened to Dr. such and such give a talk. That's cool, right? But it's more, I want to know what actions you're taking, because sometimes it's your ability to show up in the moment that really, really matters. And the only way you can really show up in the moment is if I think you're more actively engaged in learning and reflection than only allowing yourself to be in a learning stance and believing that is the only action that you should be or need to be taking. Yeah. So that's what I would leave. Thank you for asking that question. I didn't know that I would answer that way, but that's what I would offer.
Thank you for
the benefit of doing the end of year kind of work. It's like I can just kind of frame it all around recaps versus anything else,
It's fantastic. That's where can people learn more about you and your work?
I'm at Dax-Dev.com. I'm really terrible at social media, and I'm just really honest about that. It's not the medium that I'm really comfortable with. I tried for years and years. I have a Twitter handle at Dax-Dev, but I'm gonna be really frank. I don't really spend much time on it, especially these days. I'm good on email, and my books, everything's available. You can just type my name and you see stuff, and I try to get back to people. And and be in conversation with folks. But, I like to tell people I'm out here. I'm not hard to find. I'm out here.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. But and more, thank you for doing all the work that you do. And I really enjoyed this conversation. I appreciate it.
Likewise. Thank you for having me. Thank you for reaching out and creating space for people like me to come on and to be in conversation and community with your audience. So for all of you out here, you've taken some time to listen, to watch, whatever it is. Just appreciating that, because I know there's a lot of ways we can spend our time. And hopefully there's some nugget in here that I've shared that is of value to you. Appreciate you.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Please do take action. It is that one action at a time that really does make a difference and changes our cultures, changes the world. And we will see you, we will see you next week. We'll share resources and a transcript from this discussion at ally.cc. And please make sure to subscribe to our channel and rate this show. It makes a difference for us. Thank you for being part of our community. And remember, the more we take action, the more we grow as humans and as leaders, and the more we transform our communities. So what action will you take today? Let us know your actions by emailing podcast@changecatalyst.co or reaching out on social media. And Leading with Empathy and Allyship is a show by Change Catalyst where we build inclusive innovation through training, consulting, and events. You can learn more about us at changecatalyst.co. So let's keep building allyship across our communities and around the world. Thank you for listening.